Welcome to Life Stories, where we bring you incredible tales of resilience, love, and the power of the human spirit. In today's story, we follow Emma, a brave young girl whose determination to uncover the truth takes her family on an emotional journey filled with twists, danger, and unexpected revelations. As the smallest voice shines the brightest, Emma's courage teaches us profound lessons about family, justice, and hope. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories and turn on notifications so you never miss another heartwarming tale. Let's dive into today's captivating story. My name is Emma Johnson, and this is the story of how everything in my world changed overnight. I was just 8 years old when it happened, but I remember every detail as if it were yesterday. It started on a warm summer evening in Springfield, Illinois, in our small, cozy neighborhood, where everyone knew each other. Our house was always filled with laughter, love, and the smell of my mom's fresh-baked cookies. My dad, Michael, was my hero, a kind, funny man who could turn even the most ordinary day into an adventure. Life was simple, happy, and safe. At least, that's how it felt before everything fell apart. That night, my dad tucked me into bed like he always did. He kissed my forehead, told me a silly story about a talking rabbit, and made me promise not to stay up too late reading. I giggled, clutching my stuffed bunny, Mr. Wiggles, and watched as he turned off the light and closed the door. I had no idea that it would be the last normal night we'd ever have. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of loud voices and flashing lights outside my window. Rubbing the sleep from my eyes, I peeked out and saw police cars lining our driveway. Confused, I slipped out of bed and crept downstairs, clutching Mr. Wiggles tightly. That's when I saw them, 2 police officers leading my dad out of the house in handcuffs. His face was pale, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Daddy," I called out, my voice trembling. He turned to look at me, his face softening for a moment. "It's okay, Emma," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos. "Go back inside. Everything's going to be okay." But it wasn't okay. My mom, Sarah, rushed down the stairs behind me, pulling me into her arms as I cried. She was shaking too, her face pale and her voice barely a whisper. "Go back to your room, sweetheart," she said, trying to sound reassuring. "Mommy will take care of this." I didn't understand what was happening, but the fear in her voice told me everything I needed to know. Something was very, very wrong. Over the next few hours, our home turned into a whirlwind of questions and accusations. The police told my mom that my dad had been arrested for attacking our neighbor, Mr. Rogers, who lived a few houses down. Mr. Rogers had been found unconscious in his home, barely alive, and witnesses claimed they had seen my dad running from the scene. They even had evidence, my dad's fingerprints on the back door handle and his wallet near the victim's house. It didn't make sense. My dad wasn't capable of hurting anyone. He was the kind of person who helped neighbors fix their fences and played baseball with the kids on our street. But the evidence seemed damning. And the neighbors, people who used to smile and wave at us, started avoiding our family. Some whispered behind our backs, others outright told their kids not to play with me anymore. At school, the whispers followed me like a shadow. "That's the girl whose dad hurt someone," they'd say. "Stay away from her." I tried to be brave, but every day felt heavier than the last. I missed my dad so much it hurt. And my mom, strong, loving, and determined, was trying her best to hold us together. But I could see the cracks in her armor. She worked long hours at the hospital, then came home to piles of bills and endless worry. I heard her crying at night when she thought I was asleep, and it made me feel so helpless. One afternoon, while I was playing in our backyard, I overheard 2 police officers talking outside Mr. Rogers' house. They didn't see me crouched behind the fence, clutching Mr. Wiggles like he could somehow make it all better. "Something about this case doesn't sit right with me," one officer said. The other shrugged. "Maybe. But the DA has enough to convict him." The fingerprints alone. The first officer interrupted, lowering his voice. I keep thinking about those other break-ins in the neighborhood. Same method of entry. Same kind of victim. But no arrests. What if? I didn't hear the rest. But my heart was racing. Other break-ins? What were they talking about? I ran inside to tell my mom. But she was too tired to listen. Not now, Emma, she said, rubbing her temples. I can't deal with this right now. That night, as I lay in bed hugging Mr. Wiggles, an idea began to form. I didn't know much about laws or evidence. But I knew one thing, my dad was innocent. And if no one else could prove it, I would. The next few weeks were a blur of secret missions and careful listening. I started paying attention to every conversation, every detail, hoping to find something that could help. I even sneaked into my dad's lawyer's office one day, pretending to look for the bathroom, and caught a glimpse of the case files on his desk. One thing stood out to me: Mr. Rogers had recently argued with another neighbor, Mr. Blake, about money. I remembered seeing Mr. Blake, a grumpy old man who lived alone, sneaking around the neighborhood late at night. My heart pounded as I wondered, could he have something to do with it? But how could I prove it? I was just a little girl. No one would listen to me. The answer came unexpectedly one evening while I was flipping through TV channels. I stopped on a courtroom drama, watching wide-eyed as a young witness took the stand and told the truth. Even though it was scary, the lawyer in the show said, "Sometimes even the smallest voices can speak the loudest." Those words stuck with me. Maybe, just maybe, I could do that too. When my dad's trial began, I begged my mom to let me go. At first, she said no, not wanting me to see my dad like that. But I wouldn't give up. "Please, Mom," I said, my voice breaking. "I have to be there." Reluctantly, she agreed. Sitting in the back of the courtroom, I felt small and out of place. But I kept my eyes on my dad, who looked tired and broken. The prosecutor painted him as a desperate man with a motive to hurt Mr. Rogers. And witness after witness testified against him. My hope began to waver. But I couldn't give up. Then, on the third day of the trial, everything changed. During a break, I overheard the prosecutor on the phone, mentioning a key piece of evidence, a security camera that had been damaged during the break-in. My heart raced as I remembered seeing Mr. Blake near that camera with his tools a few days before the crime. I had even told my mom about it, but she had dismissed it as unimportant. I tugged on my dad's lawyer's sleeve, whispering urgently, "I need to talk. I know something." He hesitated, glancing at my mom, who looked bewildered, but eventually nodded. And that's how I found myself on the witness stand, clutching Mr. Wiggles, my voice trembling but steady as I told the courtroom what I had seen. "I saw Mr. Blake near the security camera before it broke," I said. "He was fixing it, or at least that's what I thought." The room erupted into murmurs, and the judge had to call for order. For the first time in months, I saw a flicker of hope in my dad's eyes. Maybe, just maybe, the truth was finally starting to come to light. The courtroom was silent, save for the faint shuffling of papers as the judge leaned forward, his brow furrowed in thought. My small voice had managed to cut through the tension like a spark in the dark. For a moment, I felt the weight of every gaze in the room pressing down on me. My heart was pounding so loudly, I wondered if anyone else could hear it. The prosecutor stood abruptly, his face a mix of frustration and disbelief. "Your Honor, this is highly speculative," he argued, his voice sharp. "We're relying on the observations of a child. This cannot be considered credible evidence." But my dad's lawyer, Mr. Grayson, didn't back down. He adjusted his glasses, his calm voice carrying confidence. "Your Honor, while the testimony comes from a young witness, it directly points to a potential lead that has not been investigated. Dismissing it outright would be premature." The judge tapped his gavel lightly, signaling for order. He looked down at me, his expression softening just a little. "Miss Johnson," he said gently, "you're very brave to share this with us. Is there anything else you remember that could help us understand what you saw?" I clutched Mr. Wiggles tightly, my fingers running over the soft, worn fabric of his ears. My mind raced as I tried to recall every detail. "I saw Mr. Blake talking to Mr. Rogers a few days before," I said, my voice trembling but determined. "They were arguing about something. I couldn't hear what. But Mr. Blake looked really angry. And then, later, I saw him near the camera, right before it broke." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. I looked over at Mr. Blake, who was sitting in the audience. His face had turned pale, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He looked furious and, for the first time, nervous. The judge glanced at the prosecutor. "Mr. Collins, given the new testimony, I'm inclined to grant the defense's request to investigate this matter further." The prosecutor sighed, clearly frustrated but unable to argue. "Very well, Your Honor." The gavel came down with a decisive crack. "Court is adjourned until tomorrow. In the meantime, law enforcement will follow up on this new information." As the courtroom emptied, I felt a mix of relief and fear. I had done what I could. But now it was up to the adults, the lawyers, the police, to uncover the truth. My mom hugged me tightly, her face a mixture of pride and worry. "You were so brave, Emma," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But I just hope this doesn't make things harder for us." The ride home was quiet. My mom's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. I stared out the window, my thoughts racing. Had I done the right thing? What if Mr. Blake found out where we lived? What if he tried to hurt us? I felt a pang of guilt for dragging my mom into something so dangerous. But deep down, I knew I couldn't have stayed silent. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mr. Blake's face, his piercing glare, the way his hands fidgeted in his lap as if he were trying to keep himself from running. I hugged Mr. Wiggles tightly, whispering to him as if he could somehow protect me. "We're doing the right thing," I murmured. "We have to help Daddy." The next morning, the police arrived at our house. Detective Harris, a tall man with a kind but serious expression, introduced himself to my mom. He asked if he could speak with me about what I had seen. My mom hesitated, her protective instincts kicking in. But eventually, she agreed. Sitting at the kitchen table, Detective Harris leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Emma, I need you to tell me everything you remember about Mr. Blake, anything at all. Even if it seems small." I took a deep breath, recounting the argument between Mr. Blake and Mr. Rogers, the broken security camera, and the way Mr. Blake had been sneaking around the neighborhood at night. Detective Harris nodded, taking careful notes. "That's very helpful," he said. "We'll look into it right away." "Do you think Mr. Blake did it?" I asked, my voice small. Detective Harris paused, choosing his words carefully. "We don't know yet. But your information gives us a new direction to investigate. You've done something very important, Emma." After he left, my mom sat down beside me, pulling me into a tight hug. "You've done enough, sweetheart," she said softly. "Let the police handle the rest." But I couldn't just let it go. My dad's freedom, our family's future, depended on finding the truth. Over the next few days, I watched as the police swarmed Mr. Blake's house, searching for evidence. The neighbors whispered and speculated, but no one seemed to know much about him. He had always kept to himself, a grumpy old man who rarely left his house except to run errands or tinker with his tools in the yard. Then, one afternoon, the news broke. The police had found something in Mr. Blake's shed, a toolbox filled with tools that matched the marks on the broken security camera, as well as a pair of gloves that appeared to have traces of blood on them. They were sending the gloves to a lab for testing. But Detective Harris was confident they were onto something. When my mom told me, I felt a surge of hope. Maybe this would finally clear my dad's name. But it also scared me. If Mr. Blake was guilty, what would he do if he found out I was the one who had spoken up? That night, my mom double-checked the locks on all the doors and windows before tucking me into bed. "Don't worry, Emma," she said, kissing my forehead. "The police are watching our house. We're safe." But I wasn't sure I believed her. Lying in the dark, I clutched Mr. Wiggles tightly and stared at the ceiling, my mind spinning with what ifs. What if the gloves didn't match? What if Mr. Blake had an alibi? What if my dad never came home? The next morning, Detective Harris called with an update. The blood on the gloves matched Mr. Rogers' DNA. It was the breakthrough we had been waiting for. Mr. Blake was arrested later that day, and the police found even more evidence tying him to the crime: a receipt for a crowbar purchased the day before the attack, and a journal where he had written about his anger toward Mr. Rogers. When my mom told me, I burst into tears, not out of sadness, but out of sheer relief. For the first time in weeks, I felt like we were finally moving toward justice. But the fight wasn't over yet. The evidence against Mr. Blake was strong, but it wasn't enough to clear my dad completely. As the trial continued, I realized that the journey to prove his innocence would be longer and harder than I had imagined. The courtroom was packed as the trial continued. The evidence against Mr. Blake was strong, but the case against my dad, Eric Johnson, wasn't resolved yet. Every time the prosecutor brought up the fingerprints or my dad's wallet, my heart sank. Even though the police had found the bloody gloves and the tools in Mr. Blake's shed, there was still a mountain of doubt lingering over my dad's innocence. I sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, clutching Mr. Wiggles as if he could somehow keep me calm. My mom sat beside me, her hands tightly folded in her lap, her jaw set with determination. We were trying to stay strong for my dad, but I could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped just slightly at the end of each long day in court. Mr. Grayson, my dad's lawyer, was doing everything he could to dismantle the prosecutor's case. On this particular day, he was cross-examining Detective Harris about the wallet found near Mr. Rogers' house. "Detective Harris," Mr. Grayson began, pacing in front of the jury box, "you testified earlier that Eric Johnson's wallet was found on the scene. Correct?" "Yes, that's correct," Detective Harris replied, his tone measured. "And you also testified that the fingerprints on the wallet matched Mr. Johnson's?" "Yes. But," Mr. Grayson continued, "did you test the wallet for other fingerprints or DNA that might indicate someone else had handled it?" Detective Harris hesitated for a moment. "We did find smudges, but they were inconclusive. We couldn't determine if another person had handled the wallet." Mr. Grayson stopped pacing and turned to the jury. "So, you're saying it's possible someone else placed the wallet there to frame Mr. Johnson?" The prosecutor jumped to his feet. "Objection. Speculative." The judge considered for a moment before nodding. "Sustained." Mr. Grayson. "Rephrase." "Of course, Your Honor," Mr. Grayson said smoothly. He turned back to Detective Harris. "Is it possible that the wallet could have been placed at the scene by someone other than Eric Johnson?" "It's possible," Detective Harris admitted reluctantly, "but we have no evidence to support that theory." As the jury murmured amongst themselves, I saw the prosecutor frown, clearly frustrated. Mr. Grayson had managed to plant a seed of doubt, and I couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. After court adjourned for the day, my mom and I waited for my dad to be escorted back to holding. He gave us a small, tired smile as we approached him, and I threw my arms around him, burying my face in his chest. "I miss you, Daddy," I whispered, trying not to cry. "I miss you too, Pumpkin," he said softly, stroking my hair, "but I promise, we're going to get through this." My mom stood nearby, her eyes welling up with tears. "Eric," she said, her voice trembling, "they're starting to see the holes in the case. We just have to keep fighting." He nodded. But I could see the worry etched into his face. Even though the evidence against Mr. Blake was mounting, my dad's case still hung in the balance. The weight of proving his innocence felt heavier than ever. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with my diary open in front of me. I had been writing everything down since the trial began, every testimony, every detail, every moment that might help us piece together the truth. I didn't understand everything the lawyers talked about. But I knew one thing for sure: my dad wasn't guilty. And I was determined to prove it. "Mom," I said, looking up from my notes, "what else do we need to prove Dad didn't do it?" She sighed, sitting down across from me with a cup of tea. "We need something concrete, Emma. Something that shows there's no way your dad could have been there that night." I thought back to the night the police arrested my dad. He had been at home with us, tucking me into bed and reading me a story. But the timeline was fuzzy, and the prosecutor had argued that he could have left the house after I fell asleep. "What about the security camera?" I asked. "The one Mr. Blake broke. Could it have caught something before it stopped working?" My mom frowned. "I don't know. Detective Harris said the footage from that night wasn't recoverable. Maybe they missed something," I said, a spark of determination lighting up inside me. "Can we ask them to check again?" She hesitated, clearly torn between wanting to protect me and knowing I might have a point. Finally, she nodded. "I'll call Mr. Grayson tomorrow and see if he can follow up." The next day, I sat on pins and needles as we waited for an update. When Mr. Grayson called, my mom put the phone on speaker so I could hear. "We managed to recover partial footage from the security camera," he said, his tone excited. "It's not much, but it shows someone leaving Mr. Rogers' house around the time of the attack." "Was it my dad?" I blurted out, my heart racing. "No," Mr. Grayson said firmly. "The figure on the tape is shorter and stockier than your dad. We can't see the face, but it's definitely not him." Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a new question. "Then who was it?" "We're working on identifying them," Mr. Grayson said. "But this could be a game changer." My mom hugged me tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Emma, you might have just saved your dad." Over the next few days, the recovered footage became a pivotal piece of evidence. The defense argued that the person seen leaving Mr. Rogers' house was likely the real culprit and that it wasn't my dad. The prosecutor tried to downplay it, but the jury was clearly paying attention. As the trial neared its conclusion, I felt a mix of hope and anxiety. We were closer than ever to clearing my dad's name. But the fight wasn't over yet. I clutched Mr. Wiggles tightly as we walked into the courtroom for the final day of testimony, silently praying for the truth to prevail. The courtroom was electric on the final day of testimony. It felt as though the entire world had shrunk to this one room where every word, every glance, every pause was loaded with tension. I clutched Mr. Wiggles tightly in my arms as the prosecutor prepared to deliver their final arguments. My mom sat beside me, her shoulders tense but her hands steady, a silent reminder that we were in this together. Mr. Grayson had spent the last few days building his case brick by brick, using the security footage to poke holes in the prosecution's timeline. The grainy image of the stocky figure leaving Mr. Rogers' house had shifted the momentum in our favor. And I could see the prosecutor struggling to regain control of the narrative. But they weren't going down without a fight. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor began, their voice measured but insistent. "The defense would like you to believe that the grainy, unclear footage recovered from the security camera absolves Mr. Johnson of all wrongdoing. But let me remind you, we still have his fingerprints on the back door handle and his wallet found near the scene. These are not coincidences. They are evidence." I felt my stomach twist as the prosecutor's words hung in the air. They had a way of making everything sound so damning, even when I knew the truth. My mom reached over and squeezed my hand, as if to remind me that we couldn't let fear take over. Then, it was Mr. Grayson's turn. He rose from his seat with a calm, deliberate air. walking slowly toward the jury box as he began to speak. "Evidence can tell us many things," he said, his voice steady and clear. "But it can also mislead us if we don't examine it closely. Yes, Mr. Johnson's wallet was found near Mr. Rogers' home. But ask yourselves this: why would an experienced contractor, a family man with no history of violence, leave behind something as incriminating as his wallet? And as for the fingerprints on the door handle, we've already established that Mr. Johnson had been in and out of Mr. Rogers' house multiple times for work-related reasons. Those fingerprints could have been left at any time." He paused, letting his words sink in before moving closer to the jury. "Now, consider the footage we recovered. It clearly shows someone leaving Mr. Rogers' home at the time of the attack. Someone who does not match Mr. Johnson's height or build. This is not a small detail. This is reasonable doubt." The prosecutor objected, of course, arguing that the footage was inconclusive. But I could see the jury's expressions shifting as they listened to Mr. Grayson. He wasn't just presenting facts, he was telling a story. One that made sense in a way the prosecution's theory did not. After closing arguments, the judge instructed the jury to begin their deliberations. As they filed out of the courtroom, I felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. The trial was over. But now we had to wait for the verdict. It could take hours. It could take days. And there was nothing we could do but hope. My mom and I stayed in the courthouse lobby, along with a handful of reporters and other observers. My dad's lawyer, Mr. Grayson, paced back and forth, his phone in hand, while my mom sat quietly, staring at the floor. I wanted to say something to comfort her, but I didn't know what. Instead, I leaned my head against her shoulder, and she wrapped an arm around me. The hours dragged on, each minute stretching into what felt like eternity. I tried to distract myself by flipping through my diary, reading over the notes I'd taken throughout the trial. I wanted to remind myself of all the little victories we'd had along the way. But even that didn't ease the tight knot of anxiety in my chest. Then, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the bailiff stepped into the lobby. "The jury has reached a verdict," he announced. My heart skipped a beat. This was it. My mom and I stood, and Mr. Grayson hurried over to join us. Together, we walked back into the courtroom, where the jury was already seated. My dad was brought in from holding, and when he saw us, he gave a small, hopeful smile. I wanted to run to him, to hold his hand and tell him everything would be okay. But I stayed in my seat, clutching Mr. Wiggles as tightly as I could. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. My mom reached over and took my hand, her grip firm but trembling. The foreperson of the jury stood, holding a small piece of paper. "In the case of the state versus Eric Johnson," they began, their voice steady but emotionless, "we find the defendant not guilty." The words hung in the air for a moment before the room erupted. My mom let out a sob, and I burst into tears, barely able to process what I'd just heard. My dad stood frozen for a moment, his mouth slightly open in disbelief, before Mr. Grayson clapped him on the back and whispered something to him. Then he turned to us, and I ran to him, throwing my arms around his neck. "You're coming home," I cried, my voice muffled against his shirt. "I'm coming home," he whispered back, his voice thick with emotion. "I told you we'd get through this, pumpkin." Later that evening, after the chaos had died down and we were back home, my dad tucked me into bed for the first time in what felt like forever. He sat on the edge of my bed, his hand resting gently on my shoulder. "Emma," he said, his voice soft, "I can never thank you enough for what you did. You're the bravest girl I know." I smiled up at him, my heart full. "I just wanted to help, Daddy." "And you did," he said, leaning down to kiss my forehead. "You helped save me." As he turned off the light and closed the door, I hugged Mr. Wiggles tightly, feeling a peace I hadn't felt in months. My dad was home. My family was whole again. And even though the scars from this ordeal would take time to heal, I knew we would face the future together, stronger than ever. The days that followed my dad's return home felt surreal. 4 months. My life had been consumed by the trial, by whispers at school, and by the suffocating fear that I might never get my dad back. Now, as we sat at the dinner table as a family again, sharing stories and laughing over my mom's slightly burned lasagna, it felt like we had been given a second chance. But it also felt fragile, as if the happiness could be taken away at any moment. My dad was quieter than before, though he tried to put on a brave face. I noticed how he sometimes zoned out during conversations, his fork hovering over his plate as his eyes lost focus. When I asked him about it, he just smiled and told me he was tired. But I knew it was more than that. Prison had changed him. Even in the few short months he'd been there, it was like he was carrying invisible scars. And I didn't know how to help him. My mom, on the other hand, threw herself into normalcy with a kind of desperate energy. She cleaned the house from top to bottom, baked cookies for our neighbors, and even took up gardening, even though she'd always said she hated getting dirt under her nails. It was as if she believed that if she just worked hard enough, she could scrub away the memory of everything we'd been through. As for me, I tried to adjust to life at school. Some kids had started talking to me again, offering timid apologies for the way they'd treated me when my dad was on trial. Others avoided me completely, as if being near me would somehow bring trouble into their lives. I didn't mind, though. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. The heavy weight that had been sitting on my chest was gone, replaced by a cautious optimism. One afternoon, about a week after the verdict, my dad took me to the park. It was a sunny day, with a gentle breeze that carried the smell of freshly cut grass. We walked side by side, and though he tried to make small talk, I could tell he had something on his mind. "Emma," he said finally, stopping by the swings, "I need to ask you something." I tilted my head, curious. "What is it?" He hesitated, his eyes scanning the park as if he were searching for the right words. "Why didn't you tell me about everything you did during the trial? About the witness stand? And the diary? And, well, all of it?" I looked down at my shoes, kicking at a patch of dirt. "I didn't want you to worry," I said softly. "You had enough to deal with." He crouched down in front of me, his hands resting on my shoulders. "Emma, what you did was incredible. You were so brave. But you don't have to do everything on your own. Okay? We're a team. You can always come to me." I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. "I just wanted to help." "And you did," he said, pulling me into a hug. "You helped more than you'll ever know." As the weeks went by, life began to settle into a new rhythm. My dad started working part-time at a hardware store, easing back into the world outside our house. My mom picked up extra shifts at the hospital to make up for the financial strain we'd been under, and I threw myself into my schoolwork, determined to catch up on everything I'd missed. But there was one thing that kept nagging at me: the letter. The single, cryptic sentence, "The truth isn't always what it seems," had been tucked away in the back of my mind. Like a puzzle piece I couldn't quite fit into the picture. I had tried to push it aside, to focus on moving forward. But it lingered, whispering to me in quiet moments. One evening, as we sat in the living room watching a movie, the doorbell rang. My mom paused the TV and went to answer it. When she returned, she was holding a small package, her brow furrowed. "It's for you, Emma," she said, handing it to me. "For me?" I asked, surprised. I took the package and turned it over in my hands. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, with no return address. My name was written on the front in neat, blocky handwriting. My dad leaned forward, his expression serious. "Who sent it?" "I don't know," I said, carefully peeling back the paper. Inside was a notebook, similar to the one I used for my diary. I opened it to the first page, and my heart skipped a beat. Scrawled across the top of the page in the same blocky handwriting were the words, "Keep asking questions." Beneath it were dozens of entries, each one detailing events and names connected to my dad's trial. Some of it was information I already knew, like the timeline of the attack on Mr. Rogers. But other parts were completely new. There were notes about Mr. Baldwin's financial dealings, mentions of a man named Cameron Tate, and even a cryptic reference to something called the ledger. "What is this?" my mom asked, peering over my shoulder. I think it's evidence," I said, my voice trembling. My dad took the notebook and flipped through the pages, his jaw tightening. "Whoever sent this knows a lot about the case," he said. "Too much." My mom frowned. "Do you think it's safe? What if it's a trap?" "We have to tell Detective Grayson," I said firmly. "This could be important." The next morning, we brought the notebook to the police station. Detective Harris met us in his office, his expression grim as he examined the contents. "This is unsettling," he admitted. "Whoever sent this seems to know a lot about Baldwin and Langley. But the question is, why send it to you?" I shrugged, feeling a knot of anxiety in my stomach. "Maybe they wanted me to help. Like with my diary." Harris sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "We'll need to verify everything in here. If even half of it is true, this could be the missing piece we've been looking for." My dad frowned. "I thought the case was closed." "It is," Harris said carefully. "But if there's more to the story, if Baldwin or Langley were working with someone else, we need to know." As we left the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of something big. The trial was over, but the mystery wasn't. And deep down, I knew we were about to uncover something that would change everything again. The notebook felt heavier with each passing day, as if it carried not just information, but a weight of responsibility I wasn't sure I could handle. Detective Harris had promised to keep us updated as they verified its contents. But waiting was agonizing. Every time the phone rang, my heart would race, wondering if it was him with new information, or worse, someone trying to scare us into silence. One night, as we sat at the dinner table, my dad broke the silence. "Emma," he said, setting his fork down and looking at me with a mix of pride and worry, "you've done more than anyone could ever ask for. But I want to make sure you know you don't have to keep carrying this burden. The police will handle it from here." I nodded, but I didn't say anything. I couldn't explain it, not even to myself. But I felt like I was meant to see this through. The notebook had been sent to me, not the police. And though I couldn't say why, it felt personal, like whoever sent it trusted me to make sense of it. The days dragged on without any word from Detective Harris, and the tension in our house was palpable. My mom tried to distract herself with cleaning, organizing, and gardening, but I could tell she was just as anxious as I was. My dad spent a lot of time staring out the window, lost in thought. And me, I couldn't stop flipping through the notebook, memorizing every name, every detail, hoping that something would click. Then, one afternoon, as I sat on the floor of my bedroom with the notebook spread out in front of me, I noticed something I hadn't before. One of the entries mentioned a series of payments made by Baldwin to someone with the initials CT. The name had come up during the trial, but it had been brushed aside as unimportant. Now, staring at it in black and white, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more significant than anyone realized. I grabbed my phone and called Detective Harris. When he picked up, his voice was tired but kind. "Emma," he said, "I was just about to call you. We've been looking into the notebook." "Anne, who's CT?" I blurted out, cutting him off. There was a pause. "CT," he repeated slowly. "Cameron Tate. He was a business associate of Baldwin's years ago." "Why do you ask?" "He's in the notebook," I said, my heart racing. "There's a whole section about payments Baldwin made to him. Do you think he could be involved?" Harris sighed. "It's possible. We've been trying to track him down. But he's slippery." disappeared shortly after Baldwin's arrest. But we're not giving up. Do you think he sent the notebook? I asked. It's a theory, Harris admitted. But we don't have any proof yet. For now. We're treating the notebook as anonymous evidence. After we hung up, I sat there, staring at the name, Cameron Tate. Whoever he was, he seemed to be the missing piece of the puzzle. If the police couldn't find him, I wasn't sure how we'd ever get to the bottom of this. The breakthrough came a week later. It was a Saturday morning, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with my mom, eating pancakes, when the phone rang. My mom answered it, her expression shifting from curiosity to alarm as she listened. Okay, she said, glancing at me with wide eyes. We'll be right there. What is it? I asked as she hung up. That was Detective Harris, she said, grabbing her purse. They found Cameron Tate. When we arrived at the police station, Harris was waiting for us in the lobby. He looked more tired than usual, but there was a spark of urgency in his eyes. Come with me, he said, leading us to a conference room. Inside, there was a man sitting at the table. He looked disheveled, with a scruffy beard and dark circles under his eyes. His hands were cuffed, and he kept glancing nervously around the room. This was Cameron Tate. This is him, my dad asked, his voice low and tense. Harris nodded. We found him hiding out in a motel on the edge of town. He claims he didn't know about the warrant. But I'm not buying it. He's agreed to talk. Though. About what? My mom asked. Harris turned to Tate, his expression hardening. That's what we're about to find out. Tate hesitated, his eyes flicking toward me. She's the kid. Right, he said, his voice gravelly. The one who spoke up in court. I nodded, feeling a chill run down my spine. Why did you send me the notebook? I asked, my voice trembling. Tate let out a bitter laugh. Because you're the only one who would look at it without an agenda. Everyone else just wants to cover their own tracks. What tracks? My dad demanded. Tate leaned back in his chair, his expression turning grim. Baldwin wasn't working alone. There's a whole network of people who were involved, people who knew what was going on and kept quiet because it was easier than blowing the whistle. The money in that ledger, it wasn't just embezzlement. It was hush money, bribes, payoffs. Baldwin was keeping everyone happy so they wouldn't talk. And you? Harris asked. Were you part of that network? Tate's jaw tightened. I took the money, he admitted. But I didn't hurt anyone. When I found out Baldwin was willing to kill to keep his secrets, I bailed. That's why he turned on me. Why didn't you come forward sooner? My mom asked, her voice shaking. Tate shrugged. I didn't think anyone would believe me. But then the trial happened. And the kid, he nodded toward me, she reminded me what it looks like to stand up for the truth. His words made my chest tighten. I didn't feel brave or strong. I felt like a kid who had stumbled into something way bigger than me. As Harris pressed Tate for more details, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Baldwin's crimes had gone far deeper than we'd realized. The trial had exposed some of his wrongdoings. But there were others, hidden deals, silent accomplices that had never come to light. Tate's testimony was a goldmine. But it also raised more questions. If Baldwin had a network of people helping him, how many of them were still out there? And how far would they go to keep their secrets buried? As we left the station that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The truth wasn't just a single thread, it was a web. And we were only beginning to untangle it. The revelation of Baldwin's larger network left us reeling. As we drove home from the police station, the tension in the car was palpable. My dad kept tapping the steering wheel, his brows furrowed in deep thought. My mom sat in silence, staring out the window, her fingers nervously fiddling with the strap of her purse. And me. I clutched my diary tightly in my lap, trying to process everything Cameron Tate had said. Do you think he's telling the truth? I finally asked, breaking the silence. My dad sighed. his eyes fixed on the road. It's hard to say. People like him, people who've been caught, they'll say anything to save their own skin. But he came forward. I argued. He sent me the notebook. That has to mean something, doesn't it? My mom turned to face me, her expression soft but serious. Emma, just because someone tells you part of the truth doesn't mean they're telling you everything. We have to be careful. I nodded. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that Tate's confession was just the tip of the iceberg. If Baldwin really had a network of accomplices, then this wasn't just about him anymore. It was bigger than that, bigger than anything I'd ever imagined. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my parents whispering in the kitchen. I crept down the hallway and stopped just outside the door, listening. We need to be prepared for whatever comes next, my mom was saying. If Baldwin's network is as extensive as Tate claims, then there's no telling who might come after us. My dad's voice was calm but firm. Harris promised he'd keep us safe. We just have to trust him. But what if that's not enough? My mom pressed. What if? I stepped into the kitchen before she could finish. What's going on? I asked, pretending I hadn't been eavesdropping. My mom forced a smile, but I could see the worry in her eyes. Nothing. Sweetheart. We were just talking about precautions. Precautions for what? I pressed. For the investigation, my dad said quickly. Harris thinks things might get complicated, but we'll be fine. I nodded, pretending to believe him, but the uneasy feeling in my stomach told me otherwise. Over the next few days, the tension in our house only grew. Detective Harris called regularly to update us on the investigation. But his updates were often frustratingly vague. We're following leads, he would say. Or we're making progress, but he never gave us any concrete details. Meanwhile, the media frenzy around Baldwin's trial had died down, leaving us in a strange kind of limbo. The reporters who had once camped outside our house had moved on to the next big story, and our neighbors had stopped whispering behind our backs. On the surface, everything seemed normal, but it wasn't. I spent most of my time poring over my diary, trying to piece together any clues that might help. I kept coming back to the same question. Why had Tate sent me the notebook? Why me? Of all people. What was it about our family, or about me, that made him trust us with such dangerous information? The answer came sooner than I expected. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when Detective Harris showed up at our house unannounced. He looked exhausted, his clothes slightly rumpled and dark circles under his eyes. My parents invited him in, and we all sat down in the living room. We've made some progress, he said, his tone serious. Tate's information has been helpful, but it's also raised some new concerns. Concerns about what? My dad asked. Harris hesitated, then leaned forward, lowering his voice. There's someone else. A name that keeps coming up in our investigation. Someone who might be pulling the strings behind the scenes. Who? My mom whispered. Harris glanced at me, then back at my parents. We don't know yet, but we have reason to believe they're higher up than Baldwin. More dangerous. And they're not happy about Tate's cooperation. A chill ran down my spine. Do you think they'll come after him? I asked. Harris nodded grimly. It's possible. Which is why we've placed him in protective custody. But we also need to be cautious. If this person is as powerful as we suspect, they might try to silence anyone who knows too much. My dad stiffened. You think they'll come after us? We're taking every precaution to make sure that doesn't happen, Harris assured him. We've increased patrols in your neighborhood, and there will be plainclothes officers keeping an eye on your house. What about the notebook? I asked. Does it have any clues about this person? Harris hesitated again, his jaw tightening. There's one entry that stands out, he admitted. It mentions a payment to someone identified only as the benefactor. We believe this is the person behind Baldwin's network, but we don't have enough information to identify them. The benefactor, my mom repeated, her voice shaking. What kind of name is that? A dangerous one, Harris said simply. That night, I couldn't sleep. The name the benefactor echoed in my mind, sending shivers down my spine. Who were they? What did they want? And how far would they go to protect their secrets? I got out of bed and opened my diary, flipping through the pages until I found the section where I'd written about the notebook. I scanned my notes, searching for anything that might connect to this mysterious figure. And then I saw it, a small, scribbled note in the margin of one of the entries. It wasn't in Baldwin's handwriting, it was different. Sloppier. Almost like it had been added as an afterthought. Trust no one. The words sent a chill through me. Who had written them? Baldwin? Tate? Or someone else entirely? I closed the diary and stared out the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. Somewhere out there, the benefactor was hiding in the shadows, watching and waiting, and I couldn't shake the feeling that our family was still in their sights. The name the benefactor loomed over us like a shadow, an unseen threat that seemed to grow darker with each passing day. My parents tried to shield me from the weight of it. But I wasn't a child anymore, not after everything we had been through. I could see the tension in their faces, the whispered conversations when they thought I wasn't listening, the way my dad jumped at every creak of the floorboards. The house felt quieter than usual, almost too quiet. Even though I knew there were plainclothes officers patrolling our street, the knowledge didn't bring much comfort. If this benefactor was as powerful as Detective Harris believed, how long would it be before they tried to make their next move? I spent my days trying to distract myself with homework and reading, but my mind always wandered back to the notebook and that cryptic phrase scrawled in the margin, "Trust no one." Who had written it? Baldwin? Tate? Or someone else entirely? What were they trying to warn us about? One afternoon, while my mom was at work and my dad was in the backyard fixing the fence, I decided to revisit the notebook. I had memorized every entry, every scribble, but something kept nagging at me. I felt like I had missed something, some small detail that could unravel the mystery of the benefactor. I laid the notebook out on the kitchen table, flipping through the pages carefully. Most of the entries were straightforward: payments, dates, blackmail notes, and cryptic references to other accomplices. But then my eyes landed on a single line buried near the end of the notebook. Meeting at Cedar Creek. 7 p.m. Final arrangements with B. I frowned. Cedar Creek. The name was familiar. It was a secluded park on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods. My dad had taken me there once when I was younger, and I remembered it being quiet and almost eerie, especially as the sun went down. I grabbed my diary and started jotting down thoughts. The meeting couldn't have been recent, not if it was part of Baldwin's network, but something about the note felt important. Why would Baldwin bother to write it down if it wasn't significant? And who was B? Baldwin himself? Or someone else? I stared at the page for a long time before making a decision. I needed answers. And if the police couldn't find them fast enough, maybe I could. That evening, I waited until after dinner to bring up the notebook. My parents and I were sitting in the living room, the TV playing softly in the background. My dad was flipping through channels, and my mom was scrolling through her phone. But I could tell they were both distracted. "Dad," I said, breaking the silence, "do you remember Cedar Creek?" He looked up, surprised. "Yeah, sure. Why?" I hesitated, then opened the notebook and pointed to the entry. "There's a note about a meeting there. Baldwin wrote it down. Do you think it's important?" My dad leaned forward, squinting at the page. My mom set her phone down and joined him, her brow furrowed. "Final arrangements," my mom read aloud. "That doesn't sound good." "It could be nothing," my dad said cautiously. "Or it could just be another dead end." "But what if it's not?" I pressed. "What if there's something there? A clue? Or evidence?" My mom sighed. "Emma, I know you want to help, but it's too dangerous. You're not going to Cedar Creek. And neither are we." I wasn't saying we should go. I lied quickly. I just thought maybe we should tell Detective Harris. My dad nodded. That's the right call. Let the police handle it. I nodded too. But deep down, I knew that wasn't enough. The police were doing their best. But they couldn't be everywhere at once. And if the benefactor really was still out there, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, we didn't have time to waste. The next morning, I woke up before dawn, my heart pounding with nervous energy. My parents were still asleep, and the house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I dressed quickly, grabbed my diary, and slipped out the back door, careful not to make a sound. The air was crisp and cool as I biked toward Cedar Creek. The streets eerily empty. My stomach churned with a mix of fear and excitement. I knew what I was doing was reckless. My mom would be furious if she found out, but I couldn't ignore the feeling in my gut that something important was waiting for me. When I reached the park, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the trees. The place was even quieter than I remembered, the only sounds coming from the rustling leaves and the distant chirping of birds. I left my bike near the entrance and started walking, clutching my diary tightly. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, a hidden stash, a clue, anything that might connect Baldwin to the benefactor. The notebook had mentioned final arrangements, which made me think of something permanent, like a buried item or a hidden cache. I scanned the ground as I walked, searching for anything out of place. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled upon a small clearing surrounded by trees. In the center was a fire pit, its ashes long since cold. I knelt down and ran my fingers through the dirt, my heart racing. And then, I saw it, a small metal object glinting in the sunlight. It was a key. I picked it up, my hands trembling. It was old and slightly rusted, but there was no mistaking what it was. I turned it over, looking for any markings, and saw a small engraving on the side, C&R storage. Storage. My mind raced. Was this what Baldwin had been referring to in the notebook? A storage unit. I slipped the key into my pocket and stood up, my heart pounding. I had found something. But now I had a new problem: what to do with it. Should I take it straight to Detective Harris? Or should I wait and see what my parents thought? As I walked back to my bike, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just uncovered a piece of the puzzle, one that could finally lead us to the benefactor. But I also knew that whoever had hidden the key wouldn't be happy about me finding it. And if they found out, things could get dangerous. Very dangerous. As the truth finally came to light and the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Emma and her family could finally breathe again. The journey had tested their strength, their courage, and their love for one another. The mystery of the benefactor had unraveled, revealing not only the danger that lurked in the shadows but also the resilience of a family determined to protect each other no matter what. Through it all, Emma had learned that even the smallest voice could make the biggest difference. And that hope, love, and determination were the most powerful forces of all. Though the scars of their ordeal would remain, the Thompsons emerged stronger, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable journey. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring tales that will move your heart and ignite your spirit. See you in the next story.